PhD, and today we'll talk about frozen frogs and climate change. Okay, so I'd like first to tell you about my pathway to science and how I got to studying what I am studying today. So I grew up, was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, and after I finished high school, I moved to California where I went to college and I studied biology and ecology at University of California in Los Angeles. And I got really interested in wildlife and studying the natural world around me. And I decided to go back home to study marine science. So I did some work on the Red Sea right there. And I studied microalgae. It's the stuff that lives in the tissues of corals and other sea organisms. And then I went back to the United States, where I am right now, in New Haven, Connecticut, and I'm studying, again, ecology and evolutionary biology. I want to spend a few moments to tell you about my time in college and what I studied and how that really sparked my interest in what I'm studying today and what I chose to specialize in for my career. So when I was in college, I got to do this really cool course. It was a semester long, and I worked with other students, and we developed our own research projects. So we were able to design a project from start to finish, figure out what was interesting and what we wanted to study. And we decided to study these lizards, the Western fence lizard. This is a photo of them. And specifically, we were looking at these parasites that were on their bodies, specifically ticks. So I know this is very gross, but they can accumulate a lot of ticks on their bodies. And we were interested in seeing how that was different in different parts in California. So I was able to do a lot of field work and go out and camping all over the state. And I enjoyed doing the project, asking questions and analyzing my data and then writing it all up. And that was what sparked my interest in the field of herpetology, which is the study of reptiles and amphibians. And today, for my PhD, I'm studying this species of frogs called the wood frogs. This was a photo from a few years back where we usually go out at night to collect frogs because they're more active, especially on rainy nights. Okay, so there are several goals for today that I'd like to go over. So first, we'll talk about how these wood frogs are able to survive freezing over winter. And then I'll tell you about some methods that enable us to study the variation in this freeze tolerance ability. And lastly, we'll talk about how these frogs might be impacted as our climate is changing in the future. Okay, so I have a question. In the winter, which is almost here, it's fall right now, it's getting colder. So when it gets really cold and snowy outside, what do you do? How do we stay warm? How do we cope with this? And feel free to write in the chat if you have any ideas about how we as humans are able to survive the winter. So maybe some of you have guessed that we put on our coats. We take our coats from storage, we put on our scarves and our thick, comfy socks, and that allows us to survive in our environment. So we don't have to just stay inside all day. We can still go out, we can walk to school, we can take a walk. And the other thing that we're able to do is turn on the heat. So we can heat our homes, our schools, and these adaptations allow us to continue existing in our environments, and we don't have to move, for example. Okay, so that's for humans, but what about animals? Animals can't just put on a coat. They can't really turn on the heat where they're living. And there are different ways that animals cope with this. Some of the animals can migrate. So specifically with some birds, they will move to, some North American birds will move to South and Central America when it gets really cold. Other animals like this snowshoe hare can adapt to its environment And I'm not going to tell you exactly what it does because I will ask you about this a little bit later. Another method is hibernation, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as torpor. And this is where animals like bears will enter this very deep state of sleep. So they will slow down their heart rate and metabolism, and they will spend a few months just sleeping and waiting in these dens that are warm enough for them. But today we're going to talk about another really cool strategy, which is freezing. So this is the wood frog, the frog that I study. And in this photo, it is completely frozen. You'll see like it's covered in ice. Its eyes are glazed over. And in this state, they are solid like blocks of ice, and they don't have a heart rate. There's no brain activity. So they're kind of suspended in time. And just briefly to tell you how their bodies are able to do this, they will produce different molecules in their cells, and that just makes the cells unfreezable, and that's how they're able to survive. But then the rest of their body actually freezes and will produce ice crystals, and that's totally fine and normal for them. So maybe you're wondering, how much cold can they handle? Can they survive in like the coldest parts of the Arctic where the temperatures are below zero for months at a time? Can they stay frozen for like a couple days or months or like a year? You know, if you put one in a freezer, will it survive? And the short answer is we still don't know their limits. And that is something that motivates my the science that I do. And we're trying to understand what are these limits. Um, there are some different ideas about this. Some scientists say that the more these frogs enter and exit a freeze process, that they will be more tolerant. So if you think about a regular winter that we have, it's not cold all the whole time, right? So you have some days where it's super cold, below freezing, and you're really bundled up, but then it warms up in a couple days, and then you have another cold snap. And that's exactly what these animals also experience in nature, in the forest, where they're hibernating under leaf litter. So they're not consistently frozen for the whole winter. They might be frozen for a bit, they'll thaw, but they'll stay in their hibernacula, and then it will get much colder again, so they'll freeze again. So some scientists say that the more they enter and exit these freeze-thaw cycles, that they'll be more tolerant of the freezing. But other scientists say that this is actually very exhausting for them, right? Because imagine you're freezing and thawing multiple times. That takes a lot of energy from the body. So it might actually be a disadvantage. So I think it's very exciting that we still don't know. And there's some scientists out there who are trying to understand specifically what's going on there. Okay, so here I'm showing you a map of North America, so United States and Canada, and in green is the range of the wood frog. So this is where they are found in nature, and you can see they cover a very wide range. They have their southern limits in Georgia and Alabama, and they go all the way into the Arctic parts of Canada and Alaska. And if we want to start understanding the limits of this freeze tolerance ability, it's really important that we look at the most extreme populations, right? Like, where are these frogs living, where it's the coldest, where you have the longest winters and the coldest winters. To answer that question, I did a field expedition to this spot right here in Alaska, Northwest Arctic Borough, along the Kobuk River. And I went there to collect samples from these frogs. So this is me and my team. The summer of 2021, we went out to look for frogs. So you can see it's not frozen over because we went in the summer. And we found tons of frogs, and we processed the samples. So that just means we collect a little tissue sample from like a toe clip or a piece of their liver, and we preserve it and bring it back with us to the lab, and then we perform DNA extractions. And this, to remind you what DNA is, it is the genetic composition of an organism. And we use that DNA to perform genome sequencing. So this is a tool that allows us to know what is the full unique composition of that DNA sequence for a given organism. So here, to remind you, the DNA is this, and it is made up of these 4 letters, right? These 4 bases. And what we do is we have different frogs from different populations. So a frog from Alaska, from Connecticut, from Georgia, from Alabama, and we do the sequencing, and then we get this list of all the letters that make up their DNA, and we line them all up, and then we can compare. So some of them will have the same base at the same position, but then some will have a different letter at the same place. And these differences are what allows us to understand what their potential is to have different DNA to adapt to different challenges in their environment. And so this is part of my work that I do is DNA sequencing of hundreds and hundreds of samples of frogs. All right, so for the last goal for today is talk about how these frogs will be impacted by the climate. So scientists predict that climate is changing and our winters are going to get warmer, but also more variable. And if you recall what I was talking about with the freeze-thaw cycles is that we still don't know if it's good for them to have more freeze-thaw cycles or if it's bad. So in here, we can visualize what could happen if you have multiple freeze-thaw cycles. So you go into cycle 1, cycle 2, and cycle 3, and the energy consumption will increase. And this could be very detrimental for frogs because they are not actively feeding in the winter. They don't really eat. And so these could have a lot of metabolic costs on their bodies with time. And so one thing we can try to ask is, as it gets warmer and these frogs are not really doing well in the spots where the winters are shorter and just not as cold, where they're not spending most of their time in this conserved state of freezing, that we might see shifts in distribution. So I've colored in this area in red. That's just a little arbitrary. So you can see that some of the frogs, the populations that live there in warmer climates, might start to move up in the range to seek colder areas. And so we might see this like shrinking of the range, and they won't be as widespread because their habitats are not suitable anymore. So we still don't know. There's a lot of research that goes into kind of predicting these future shifts in distribution for wood frogs and other animals. So scientists are asking these questions every day. Cool. All right. So that is it for the main presentation. I think we'll have time for questions later, which I'm very excited about. But now I will tell you a little about the activity that we're doing today, and then I believe we're going to go into our breakout rooms. So we're going to show you a list of some different animals that live in cold climates, and your job will be to identify characteristics that make them adapted to their environments. So this is our list of animals. We have the emperor penguins, polar bears, caribou, and the snowshoe hare. And to give you a little hint, think a lot about the colors that they have, the size of their feet and how they're walking on the snow, and the composition of their coats, their fur, and their bodies. Oh, sure. Yeah. Great. So for the penguins, they have a thick undercoat and they actually have a dark black undercoat because that lets them absorb a lot of heat and keep it and insulate their bodies. They also have these like large, stocky bodies that all helps them keep the heat in. And then another really cool thing they do is a very social activity. They kind of all huddle together, as you see in the photo, and that allows them to keep in the body heat. And the adults will actually like change spots so that everyone can stay warm. For the polar bears, they also have a thick undercoat and dark undercoat to again absorb heat. And then, you see their outer coat is white. This is not necessarily an adaptation to the cold, but an adaptation to their environment so that they can be camouflaged, sort of blend into the background. And then you'll notice their large paws are very large, and that helps them walk on the snow and the ice. You can like think about yourself when you're walking and it's snowy outside and your like feet just sink in. So they're able to walk comfortably. For the caribou, so they do tolerate cold climates, but when it gets too cold, they actually do migrate. They also have these short tails and short ears. And large stocky bodies, again, to insulate them, a lot of fat, which helps them retain heat. And there's one cool thing they do with their antlers. You can see there's like a little bit of snow on them. They actually like use them to brush away snow from the ground as they're like looking for grasses to eat. And lastly, for the snowshoe hare, similar to the polar bear, the outer fur is white so that they can blend in, but they have a undercoat to help them stay warm. Unlike other rabbits and hares, they have these really thick legs, as you can see in the photo. Similarly to the polar bear, it helps them walk on the snow, and they're well insulated. Their feet have a lot of fur around them to keep them warm. I think that's it for the answer, Key.
Awesome. Lum, were you going to ask some questions now?
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Yara, for having this amazing talk. I learned a lot about frogs and freeze-thaw and how they survive. I didn't know that animal freeze to survive. It's kind of counterintuitive. But yeah, we have a lot of questions for you, Yara. So the first two questions is about your job. So you showed us that you basically went to a lot of places to collect frogs across the nation. And I was just wondering, what is like the coolest place that you went to for your frog collection journey?
Yeah, it would have to be Alaska. So that's where the photos I showed you guys. I do some field work locally here in Connecticut, so it's like an hour drive, which is fun, but not as exciting as going to Alaska. We, went into the wilderness and we were on these boats for 2 weeks. So we were camping every night. And packed all our food and supplies with us and had no contact with the outside world and no cell service, no Wi-Fi. So that was really cool just to be in nature and see all the wildlife. And yeah, those are like one of my most interesting samples, like I mentioned, because they were collected from a very extreme climate.
Yeah, that's awesome. I wish I could go to Alaska. It's like sounds like really cool. And another question is, what is your favorite part about your job, you think?
Ooh, very good question. I like a lot of parts of my job. I love the field work. I think it's where I like come alive. But I also like when I'm looking at the data and actually like seeing different patterns or finding answers to questions I'm asking. And I love giving talks like this. It's one of my favorite things to actually talk to people from all backgrounds, talk to students, talk to people who are just like interested in science and actually tell them like what I'm doing and why this matters.
That's awesome. Sounds like this is the place to be. So we're going into some awesome frog related questions here. Okay, so you said that there is limits to the frog's freezing ability, but can they freeze to death? Like, how are they alive? Like, how long can they last, you think?
Yes, they can freeze to death. We've observed that if you don't freeze them at the right rate, if you freeze them too quickly, in the lab, right? I'm talking about in the lab, you're doing the experiment. If you freeze them too quickly, they will die. So you need to kind of replicate what they experience in the wild, which is a slower process of freezing that happens like over a few hours or like a day. And once they enter that state, they're frozen and they're okay. But they, again, we still don't know if they can stay like that for more than like 7 months, because that's currently the limit that we know of. There was a study in Fairbanks in Alaska where they've documented like that was the longest freezing episode that they've observed, where the frogs came out of it alive. And when you think about it biologically, like that makes sense for the frogs, right? Because like winter happens like we don't have like a 3-year long winter. So I don't know if you can, freeze a frog, put it in the freezer for 5 years and see if it will survive. I don't know if anyone has done that experiment, but it's something to look into for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I guess another follow-up question is, do all frog freezes, or is there any other strategy for them to deal with the cold?
Yeah, so not many frogs can do this. So the wood frog is one. There's 2 species of tree frogs that can do that. There's the gray tree frog and Cope's tree frog. There's a couple turtles that can do this too. But other frogs have different adaptations. So the bullfrog, for example, will overwinter at the bottom of the ponds, so bodies of water. So they will actually not experience freezing temperatures. They'll still be like in the water where it's like above freezing, and they spend the winter like that. Other frogs will seek shelter further in like the soil so that it is warmer and they don't have to experience freezing. Yeah, so different adaptations. A lot of species of frogs like live in the tropics, right? Like the tropical rainforest. So they're never really exposed to freezing cold temperatures, and they're pretty much active like throughout the whole year.
Wow, that's really cool. And another question is, when they freeze, do part of the frogs freeze first, or is there like a sequential freezing of different parts of the body? Like, do they freeze all at once, or is it the arms freeze first and stuff like that?
Yeah. So they freeze upon contact with ice. And so their outer body, the surface, starts freezing first. So the limbs, the skin, and then it, kind of goes from out to in. And we think that the last part that freezes is their heart. So they're like internal organs, and the heart freezes last. And when they're thawing, it actually starts like the opposite way. The heart will thaw first and start pumping slowly, and then you have the blood circulating through the body and slowly like thawing to the outside.
Super cool. Okay. And do you think that this thawing, like freeze thawing thing, is gonna shorten their lifespan, you think?
It's a very good question. I've thought about that, especially with their cells, right? Because they're kind of suspended in time. We don't know. We don't know if that is like the freezing thawing is like kind of like overall negative or positive. It's just like a process they go through. There's like some evidence that the frogs that are in more northern latitudes, so the places that are colder in Canada, generally live longer, like 5 to 6 years. And then ones further south, like in Connecticut, typically live for like 3-4 years. But no one has systematically tested this to see if it is a consequence of the colder climates and perhaps longer durations of freezing yet.
Right. And another curiosity from one of the students is frog is cold-blooded, right? Doesn't that make them hard to freeze?
They are cold-blooded, so they are ectotherms, which means they rely on external sources of temperature to regulate and have homeostasis. That does not make them harder to freeze. If anything, like they will kind of match the temperature of the environment they're in. So they also have like a very small body size, so they will quickly take on the temperature of whatever environment they're in.
Right. And so when you're collecting your samples and you're collecting the DNAs of the frogs through the nation, like how did you get the DNA out? Do you hurt the frogs or do you just take a little bit sample out of the animal?
Yeah, so there's different ways to do it. Sometimes we do what is called lethal sampling, where you have to sacrifice the whole frog. We euthanize it as humanely as possible, and then we'll dissect it and take out the liver, like a piece of the liver, and then we will preserve the whole animal and we will put it at a natural history museum so that it could be studied forever. But other times we can just catch the animal and take a little toe clip, which is not lethal, doesn't hurt them, and then release the animal. So it depends on what your end goal is with the purpose of the collecting that you're doing. And sometimes we collect them as tadpoles. So if you know the life cycle of the frog, they start as eggs, they hatch into these little tadpoles in the water, they're swimming, then they develop legs and they exit the pond. So sometimes we will take a tadpole whole because they're very small and yeah, use that for analysis.
All right, so one final question. So do you think that any other animal besides frogs can freeze like this to survive in the cold? Or maybe
Yeah, it's a great question. So besides frogs, a couple turtles, there's a salamander called the Siberian salamander, and it lives in Siberia, and it can freeze over winter. There's a lot of insects that can do this. So some flies and some clams can do that, but no other like birds or mammals really can do that ability.
awesome. Thank you so much for answering the question and providing that amazing talk. Hopefully in 20 years, we'll design human to freeze like this so we don't have to wear anything outside in the winter. All right.
Yeah.
I'll
Thank you.
turn to our volunteers to end. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. Thank you so much to Yara for giving that really interesting talk. So if you haven't seen all of our previous talks, we have them all on our YouTube channel here. So I know in my breakout room, some people were asking about specific topics of videos. So if you want to take a second and just like copy or screenshot this link, then you can go watch all of our previous talks about lots of different topics. And then next month, we'll have another talk. So this one will be about black holes. It'll be by Colin, who's a postdoc in the astronomy department. So if you're interested in learning about black holes, come back on November 14th. The same time, 6 p.m. And yeah, it should be really interesting also. Thank you so much.